Okay, in my study, I looked at Colin Gunton and his view of the historical Jesus. And you might want to know, who is Colin Gunton? Well, he was professor at in systematic theology at King's College when I was there. He was born in 1941 and he died in 2003 suddenly. He never wrote a systematic theology because he never had time to do that. He just had a one in draft. He was my tutor for my dissertation, but I only spoke to him very briefly because that's how it is in the UK. You just get a few minutes with the lecturers in those situations. As well as being a systematic theologian, he was a minister in the United Reformed Church in England, which is a relatively small denomination, has Presbyterianism in the bottom as its root. And his contribution to theology, mainly the two areas he worked on the most were the Trinity and the doctrine of creation. But of course he also looked at Christology, and the main book I'm going to look at, I don't know if you can see it here, that one, is Yesterday and Today, a study in the continuities of Christology. And that was written in 1983. It was one of the first books that he published when he came to King's College. But I'm also going to look at this second book. It's called The Christian Faith, which was written in 2002. So one of his last published works within his lifetime. And it's interesting to compare the two books because they're written 20 years apart. There's some similarities and some differences in his view. And I also used this third book here that you can get on Ebisco. It's called The Trinity and Humanity, which an introduction to Colin Gunton's thought. But on his chapter on Christology, he just uses Yesterday and Today, the first book, and I think there's a few weaknesses in doing that. Okay, so let's get into this Yesterday and Today, Colin Gunton's book from 1983, and I got like 4 points from that. The first one, and maybe the most important thing, is here on number 1. Colin Gunton looks at, in 2 chapters before the chapter I looked at, first looking at Christology from above, and then Christology from below, so he uses that methodology. But then in this chapter he points out that there's a problem with this methodology, because the biblical witness has both things going on at once. We see that Jesus is presented both in historical terms and in theological terms. So you can't have this division of history and theology. You must see that the Gospels present Jesus both in his historical situation, but also they interpret him theologically at the same time. And that really is like the main point of, maybe the central focus of Gunton's Christology. It's more important than the other points I'm going to mention here. The second of the 4 points is that he was very influenced by James Dunn, and the two of them are almost exactly the same age, is only 2 years apart. Dunn was just a little bit older, and he borrows Dunn's ideas that in the New Testament, Christology is developing, and it at the same time it is also plural. So there's more than one view of Jesus in the Gospels or in the New Testament. However, in contrast to Dunn's lecture that we read the other week, Gunton has a very high view, that the New Testament has a very high view of Jesus. So he actually says that Chalcedon and the Bible are very similar in their view of Jesus. and the quote here at the bottom, "The difference between the New Testament and the later work is largely a matter of degree." So he's really saying, there's a very high view of Jesus in the New Testament, and actually it's very close to Calston. It's really subtleties, small things that make the difference. So it's quite a contrast to Dunn's view that we looked at the other week. Written in 1983, this book we continue looking at yesterday today, and point 3 here is that Gunton makes a point that those who are involved in the quest for the historical Jesus make almost no use of the Old Testament, and I think that's interesting because it reflects that he was thinking like in the second quest kind of way of thinking. More in line with what we see in Bultmann, that there's no quest is really possible, sort of negative view. And he hasn't really reflected the third quest, which in 1983 was maybe just getting started, that has a very Jewish Jesus. So that's something that he changes his viewpoint, as we'll see in a minute. And then the last of these 4 points that you can see in yesterday and today is I've quoted here, the importance of God's presence and faith. I think this is a bit of an unusual emphasis in Christological thinking. So, but it's there in Gunton. He wants to say that the faith of the theologian is also important in terms of the study. It's part of the Christological enterprise, part of studying about the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith is God's presence and faith. And he has quite a good quote in the conclusion of the book here that I've put at the bottom in orange. Theology's context is that of a community of worship, belief, and action. It is here that we find the central historical continuity in the light of which Christology has to be done. So for Colin Gunton, theology has to be done within the church community. Christology has to be done within the church community. So that's his first book, 1983. And now we'll take a quick look at the second book, written in 2002. It's interesting to see that he sort of comes to more or less the same conclusions, and it made me think of Alison's slightly cynical comment about, he still has the same view of Jesus that he had when he started his academic studies. But in any case, Gunton has almost exactly the same conclusions in the later book, The Christian Faith. But there's a difference of emphasis. So he emphasizes more the Trinity and creation, which of course have become the main themes of his academic work in the 20 years between these two books. And one really noticeable difference in the methodology in this second book is that there's much greater use of the Old Testament background. And I wondered if he's responding to the third quest focus on the Jewishness of Jesus more, because he really spends nearly a whole chapter just on the Jewishness of Jesus, saying that he is prophet, priest, and king from the Old Testament, pointing out that Jesus and his followers lived in an entirely Jewish milieu, and so on. So he makes much more of the biblical and Jewishness of Jesus in this later book. By way of contrast, I then wanted to look a little bit at Paul Tillich. I've been reading Paul Tillich for one of my other courses, and I was surprised that there's some similarities between these two thinkers, even though they come to very different conclusions about who Jesus is. So Paul Tillich also has this same idea that the New Testament contains both history and theology. You can't escape one or the other. So Paul Tillich says here, Since the biblical revelation is essentially historical, it appeared to be impossible to separate the revelatory content, that's theology, from the historical reports as they are given in the biblical records. So it's the same view here, just expressed in different words. And then secondly, might come as a surprise that Tillich has a very positive view of faith, whereas the all these historical studies from his point of view cannot guarantee anything really in the Christian faith, in the Christian's life. Faith is absolutely essential in Tillich's view. So this is the second quote here. Faith is itself the immediate evidence, not mediated by conclusions, of the new being, that's his name for Christ, within and under the conditions of existence. Precisely that is guaranteed by the very nature of the Christian faith. No historical criticism can question the immediate awareness of those who find themselves transformed into the state of faith. So while there's a lack of certainty in the historical event, we can have a definite faith now in the present. Interesting conclusion. So here's a little picture of Colin Gunton. So I looked at 4 things that are important for his Christology, and then I looked at 2 things he has in common with Paul Tillich, and then finally I put a number of his criticisms perhaps you could put at his work. So the first one there is that Colin Gunton doesn't. I don't think you could say that he doesn't approach the New Testament in the same way as those who are on the quest for the historical Jesus. Yes, they're looking at the same document, but whereas in the quest they're prioritizing the synoptic gospels, Colin Gunton takes the New Testament as a whole. They're not coming with the same questions to the same text, and therefore you might argue that's why they come to different conclusions. If Colin Gunton had been more true to the quest's methodology, would he have come up with the same conclusions? We could question that. You may remember in point 2, he takes from from James Dunn the idea of there being sort of a plurality of Christs in the New Testament. He also sees that there's a development in Christology. He also says there's a development. But these things are presented as kind of facts but he doesn't draw any conclusions from it. And I wonder, had he thought more about this area, would he have come to the same conclusions? What does it mean that the Jesus of John and the Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels isn't the same? How do you deal with that? What does it mean for systematic theology? He doesn't really address any of those kind of questions. And then the final critique I put in here is, while in the second book he really makes a go of the Jewishness of Jesus, he doesn't actually quote any of the New Testament other quest scholars. Tom Wright might have been a really good help for his thesis, but he doesn't quote him. He just goes on his own, and you sort of think, wouldn't it have been good if he'd maybe quoted a few more of the known scholars in the field when discussing the issues? But all in all, I agreed with the summary of Azinor, who was the secondary reference that I made, and Azinor says this to summarize Gunton's view. Gunton, by and large, defends the Christological consensus. Let's try again. Gunton, by and large, defends the Christological consensus of the tradition, but calls into question some of its tendencies. I think that's a great summary of Colin Gunter's view on Christology and the historical Jesus.